And if you go back in time, the vision of what the Computer History Museum was all about, with Gordon Bell and Gwen Bell, who actually are here over 25 years ago. Gwen and Gordon, would you raise your hands, please? Let's give them a great hand. And then this thing happened on the West Coast. Len Shustak emerged as a person that said, gee, why aren't we preserving the artifacts and stories of the information age? And he's going to tell you a little bit about our museum, a little bit about why we exist before he introduces Woz this evening. But I want to introduce Len Shustak, who really has been a motivator for all of us, myself, a great friend, founders of companies, but more fundamentally, a love, passion, and desire of computing history, and you're going to see that strong tonight. So Len, let me turn it over to you.
Thank you, John, and welcome you all here. And for those of you who are watching on the web or watching later on the delayed broadcast, I'm sorry you couldn't get in. We turned away, I think, 150 people who wanted to be here and couldn't fit, but the fire marshal wouldn't budge. I want to thank Matthew Ives of Morgan Stanley, who is an underwriter of this event. Thank you, Matthew, and your firm for participating and supporting us. I'm always surprised at the number of people who knew about the Computer Museum in Boston, or who knew about the East-West Coast Computer Bowl, which the Computer Museum used to run, and who don't know that it no longer exists. And in fact, that's the case, and it's the sad truth. Gwen and Gordon Bell founded it 25 years ago. The good news is that we are its reincarnation, and starting in 1996, we filled up tractor trailers and moved them west and filled up many of the warehouses that surround us here at Moffett Field with computer artifacts. And the collection now is probably twice what it was in Boston. It is the largest collection of computer artifacts in the world. And that's not just hardware and iron, that's also software and paper. God, tons and tons of paper, of manuals and program listings and software on all different forms and formats, and photographs and videos and films, and basically everything you need to tell the story of a revolution, which is what the computer industry is. Our mission is to preserve and to present for posterity the artifacts and the stories of the information age. We're the only collecting museum in the world of this scale devoted solely to that effort. We've been living in these World War II vintage warehouses since 1996 and patching the leaky roofs and dealing with it because NASA has been a wonderful benefactor to us. But the wonderful news, which of course I can't avoid talking about, is our new facility. For those of you who don't know, we have bought a building and land for our permanent home. It's at 1401 Shoreline. It's at the corner of 101 and Shoreline Expressway. It's a former SGI building, 120,000 square feet on 7.5 acres. If you know where the big movie theater complex is on Shoreline, it's right opposite the entrance to the movie theater. It's a wonderful location. It's a stunning building. It's one of the few office buildings that happens to look like a museum. And we're moving in. The staff moved in yesterday. So we're starting to occupy the building. We have... We have some structural retrofit to do before we can open it to the public, but that's going to go on in the next 2 or 3 months. We're going to move in a much expanded version of visible storage, which many of you have seen over in the 126 warehouse, probably twice that size. We're going to have a 400-seat auditorium, and we're going to continue to plan for an even better and finer museum. One of the things we do is public outreach, and our ultimate public exhibits will be part of that, but right now we have no museum quality exhibits. One of the things we do is this lecture series, and Karen Matthews and her volunteers and staff have put together an amazing lecture series just this year. Some of the names: John Warnock and Chuck Geschke, 6 of the pioneers of venture capital, Mitch Waldroff talking about JCR Licklider, Al Shugart, Regis McKenna, Carver Mead, Slug Russell with Nolan Bushnell and Stuart Brand, Charlie Bachman, Doug Engelbart, the Palm Group, Donna Dubinsky, Jeff Hawkins, Ed Culligan. It just goes on and on. Charlie Spork. Coming up next year are John Hennessy and Dave Patterson in January, talking about computer architecture and MIPS and other such things. A database panel on February 10th. Judy Estrin on March 5th. On January 21st, not a lot of people know about this, we are co-hosting with Stanford the West Coast premiere of a new documentary film on Ada Lovelace and Babbage called They Dream Tomorrow, and that will be held over at Stanford. It's a spectacular film. We're doing an Apple World event in the spring. VisiCalc, Dan Brinklin, Bob Frankston, who's here today, and Mish Kapoor with Charlie Simoni will be talking about VisiCalc. We are creating history by doing these events. This was started by Gwen and Gordon back in the old days, and they were recording computer pioneers to educate people, but also to preserve that history, because every one of the lectures we do gets recorded, and that videotape becomes part of the historical archive of the museum. We're the only people doing this. And here comes the commercial. Because if you think that this is an important thing to be doing, we need your help to do it. We need you to come to these events. Thank you for coming today. Please tell your friends about it. Come to the other events. Participate. You'll enjoy it. Be a volunteer. There are lots of volunteer activities. We probably have 120 active volunteers who magnify many-fold our hardworking staff of about 20. Look in your attics. A lot of the people who come to these lectures are pioneers themselves, and they have things in their attics and basements that we would like to put in our collection. So talk to us about that. And of course, give us your money. We do not get any government money. We are a nonprofit. We are entirely funded by voluntary donations. We get a little bit of corporate support, but most of it comes from individuals. Our annual campaign is in full swing right now. You'll see cards and opportunities to donate. We make it very simple. Please think about us. This is the great time of the year to get an end-of-year tax donation. It's to a good cause. We need your support. In addition to the annual campaign, of course, we're also running a quiet phase of a capital campaign. We've got to pay for that marvelous new building that we just bought. We have a $100 million capital campaign. We are $53 million on the way toward $100 million, and that last $47 million is going to be very hard. So we'll need your help there, too. Before I introduce Woz, I should point out that because we are in an overflow situation here, the way to ask questions later on is to fill out these 3x5 cards that are at your seats with the pencils. And about 40 minutes from now, people will begin to collect them, and we'll ask the questions to the podium. That way the people in the overflow room can participate as well. Steve Wozniak. The first time I saw Steve Wozniak in action was March 5th, 1975. And the date is memorable not only because I got to meet Steve Wozniak, but because that was the day in Gordon French's garage where 32 of us got together to talk about building personal computers. And that was the first meeting of what then became the Homebrew Computer Club. And Frank Rothacker and I worked at SLAC and managed to get the SLAC Auditorium to be the venue for that Homebrew Computer Club for many, many years, as it turns out. And I have most of the old newsletters, and I was looking back at them. And this is newsletter number 2 from the Homebrew Computer Club. And one of the sections is a bunch of little want-ad personals that people put in describing what they're doing in relationship to personal computing and what projects they were working on. And, of course, the one last, because it's in alphabetical order, was Steve Wozniak at 2800 Homestead Road, number 36. I assume you don't still live there anymore. I just didn't give out your personal address, did I? And it says, this is sort of in a telegraph style. Have TVT, my own design, 65 characters per line, 28 lines, 40 chips. Have my own version of Pong, a video game called Breakthrough. It's really Breakthrough, Breakout. A NERSI reader for cassettes, very simple. Working on a 17-chip TV chess display includes 3 storage boards. A 30-chip TV display. Skills, personal skills, digital design, interfacing, I/O devices. Short on time. Have schematics. Have schematics, will travel. The Homebrew Computer Club was an unusual event, and what happened at the end of the meeting was that people would set up these card tables in the back and display things that they were working on. And I remember when Steve and Steve came in with the Apple I board and displayed the 6502/6800 version of the Apple I board, where you could change a jumper and choose which microprocessor it used. They got, a year later, though, a bunch of high-profile press coverage. Here's an article from the now defunct Palo Alto Times that talks about the Homebrew Computer Club. And one of the discussions is about the great software debate about hobbyists who are sometimes accused of stealing programs, and talks about William Gates, a software writer, who said in an open letter, "Is this fair?" But really, the more important article was one that was titled "Microcomputer Fans Form Firm." And it talks about 2 young computer enthusiasts, Steve and Steve, who couldn't afford to buy a microcomputer last year, instead decided to put together on their own one of their own, and it was so successful they decided to market it. And they went on. The Palo Alto Times was not a paragon of journalistic authenticity. I mean, the techies in the crowd will be amused at this statement that Jobs is quoted as saying that the advantage of this computer was that it used dynamic memory, whose contents can be controlled by users, in contrast to static memory. But the tagline for the pitch for the company was that despite competition from larger established firms, Jobs and Wozniak see bright market outlook. More and more people are buying computers, and even those who already have a computer want another. Jobs says it's like a car. People don't use them just to go places. They're used for other reasons, like to impress other people. Now, with all due respect to the other Steve, I think this Steve had a little bit more in mind when he designed his computers. He was really out to make computers available to the rest of us, to allow us all to participate in what is probably the biggest intellectual revolution of this century. And there's really not much I need to say to introduce Steve Wozniak. He's a Silicon Valley icon. He's a philanthropist. He's an educator. He's an engineer's engineer. And he's an all-around great guy. I give you the one, the only, Woz.
Thank you. I'm humbled by the good response and nice audience. Met a lot of nice friends here from Boston and the like. And Glenn, I still remember the best lobster I ever had in my life in view of some calculating equipment. When I grew up, okay, this story is going to be a story of kind of a lot of like events that kind of lead up through and some design decisions, things like that, to the Apple II. And it starts way back, and way back, this place was Santa Clara Valley. I mean, I took my first pictures with a Brownie camera right here at Moffett Field, and we had to ride our bikes through orchards to get to schools, and the schools we went to were very new. It had a newness and, you know, an open feeling about the whole place where we grew up. And it's not like that anymore, but I have good memories of it. Initial spark, you know, were things like you get a crystal radio and you build it with your dad, and you know what, you never listen to it or use it very much, but you tell everybody, I built the crystal radio, I built the crystal radio, and you start to become proud of such things. Well, in about third grade, my mom tested me on some flashcards, you know, and I went into school, and I beat the girls. And that's when I knew I was going to be good at mathematics. Okay, so in third grade I had that down. My parents were giving me kits that had lights and switches and wire them up in different configurations and make buzzers go and the like. And so that was also kind of giving me a direction. Not a direction towards computers per se, but an interest in electronics. And my dad was an engineer. A lot of engineers had moved to Sunnyvale to work at Lockheed. A lot of the kids in the neighborhood were into electronics. They had parents that had bottles full of resistors and stuff. And, you know, we had a lot of electronics friends in the neighborhood. In science fairs, I did some projects, and they're mostly electronic in nature, so the teachers started praising me, somehow acting like I was the good one in the class at science. I was the smart one at science and math. And, of course, that had positive feedback. I thought of myself as good and wanted to be good at these things that I was good at. Used to love to sit, you know, we had a little light that came in. I had a curfew, but we had a street light that came in through my window, and I could sit there and read Tom Swift Jr. books late into the night. Used to love to read those. A lot of you have read them, about this guy that, you know, owned a company with he and his father owned it, and he was an engineer, and they'd go into the lab, he and his friend, and hook up some contraption to, you know, hold some alien in a plasma or build a submarine or a spaceship. And, oh, wow, man, he's an engineer. He designs these things, and he goes in outer space, and he solves all these problems. Boy, wouldn't it be neat to be like that, you know, just like a television hero. About fifth grade, I did a neat science fair project, and it was a large 92 electrons, you know, painted on a big, large structure. This wasn't, you know, an afternoon project. It was, you know, many, many weekends of work and wiring up and lots of switches, and got to take the step to double pole switches, where if one switch is on, it makes the other switches work a little differently. And then that wasn't enough to do all the various electron orbits, so you can flip a switch for each possible atom and see what electrons are on. So it had to get to some relays, and if this switch is on, the relay flips and makes a whole bunch of other switches work differently. And that was kind of neat to get up to a relay that had an on or an off state. And so that was like kind of getting really into some good little closeness to logic and learning about logic. Didn't have any books or guidance, didn't know about all the computers that are here in this museum. So, you know, it was like I had a whole story of accidentally trying to discover what was a computer. What makes a computer? What is this thing they call a computer? What's it about? Around 5th grade, I read a book called SOS at Midnight, and a ham radio operator solved the day and won everything. And at the end of the book, it said, anybody of any age can be a ham radio operator. I said, oh my gosh, you know, I can't drive a car, but I could be a ham radio operator. Ordered the manuals, found a class in my neighborhood, and got my ham license in 6th grade. And it was like, you know, gosh, these little feelings, you can actually do that? It's like some of the amazing things we hear about computers, and we just want to be able to do it because we see it, and it's, you know, something amazing that takes us somewhere deeper in the world. Well, as in my ham radio, boy, I sure learned. I had a father that stressed a lot of ethics, you know, and I was going to be a protector of the airwaves. We protected the airwaves, and we tracked down, you know, bad transmitters and the like. You know, my dad also taught me something interesting. He said, the radio waves are free, you know, because anything comes to you on the radio, you're allowed to tune in and listen to on communications receivers and the like. And there's no channels you can't listen to. You could listen to every frequency back then. See, this was up until cell phones. But I had this kind of pure concept that overrides, you know, the reason, you know, it's sort of like it's a right that human beings have. And I sort of feel like, why did we give up such an important right just for cell phone frequencies? Anyway, a lot of the things that, you know, a lot of the values that I have now, I look back and they come to you at very early ages, you know, pre-10 years old even, talking to your parents, talking to friends, thinking for yourself. You know, my dad would also talk about, you know, freedom of speech. In this country, you can say what you feel about anybody and you can tell them that the government is bad and it's okay to say that, you know, your opinion. Well, now, my dad helped me out with electronics. When I needed a little help, he'd go on a blackboard and he'd show me how it eventually, you know, as we worked up, how transistors worked and how tubes worked, and would help me learn these things. He said that, you know what, the most important thing in your life is school, because we adults have made this world a really messy, awful place. And it's really, you kids go to school and you learn from our mistakes and you'll be able to make a much better world. Boy, that was neat to hear as a 10-year-old, you know, and feel like we're so important. Even the parents respect us. So I said, wow, man, the teachers, I bet they get more than engineers, huh, for salary. My father said, well, no, they don't, you know. And I said, well, elementary school teachers get more than college teachers, right? Well, no. But, you know, so I felt, oh, bummer. It should have been the other way around. But, you know, my father really didn't explain to me back then that schools are paid for by the government, which is paid for by voters. The larger a chunk of voters in one area, the more money gets allocated there. And that's how schools get their money. Well, schools support kids, but kids don't get to vote for the monies. So, of course, schools, teachers aren't going to get paid much. Anyway, I got my first transistor radio in my life. Oh, boy, I used to love to listen to that little blue radio right next to my head every night in bed. I'd leave it on all night long, every night. Oh, what an important thing in my life. You know, my dad started showing me some of the stuff he was working on at Lockheed to make very tiny, tiny circuits, smaller than transistors, and chips were coming. He took me to a Westcon show, and I got to see the first picture of 6 parts on one piece of silicon, and wow, that was just so lucky looking back to have been, you know, seen these things that were the start of chips and all. And transistor radio, I said, they're going to make better and better smaller transistors to make better radios and things for people, right? And he said, well, no, they really design the better circuits for the military and for big businesses, and they just sort of filter out, and eventually people get them. And I felt, oh, bummer. You know, I think what people want, nice life in their homes and electronics to help them, I think that's, you know, more important. Just sort of sat with that feeling inside all my life. Now, my direction started heading a little into computers when I discovered a manual that my father had at home, some journal that only goes to certain kinds of engineers back then. There were no such things as computer manuals. You didn't ever hear the word said anywhere. And it had some computer articles. It showed a big screen of memory where the dots on the screen were the actual memory bits and explained how it worked. It talked about Boolean algebra and showed the basic concepts and showed a little bit of working in it. And I started working on a piece of paper like, this is a neat little puzzle. It's like doing crossword puzzles. Man, that was just the most interesting thing in the world. And boy, so my direction was getting pretty, you know, going to wind up in computers, and I didn't know it. I mean, I went all the way through high school thinking, I'm designing computers right and left, but I don't think they ever have jobs designing computers. I mean, engineers, which I want to be, you know, they design TVs and radios and things. So in 6th grade, my science fair project was a tic-tac-toe computer, because tic-tac-toe is logic. That's what we think. In other words, if there's an X in a corner and an X in a corner and the side isn't taken, that's where you go, right? It's logic logical moves to protect and whatever. If you play every game of tic-tac-toe, which you can do, you can kind of figure out all the patterns and write down little logic circuits and OR gates, build them with transistors. Built mine on a big 3x4 piece of plywood, pounding tons of nails in, tons of transistors and diodes that my father got because he was using the early semiconductors close to the semiconductor companies. They'd give us cosmetic rejects. So I soldered all this thing together and almost got it working. But, you know, the mistake was tic-tac-toe isn't a game of logic. It's a game of psychology. You know what? And everyone I tell this to says, no, tic-tac-toe's a game of logic. You can't lose it. So I say, yeah, I'll beat you. And every time I've ever pulled that on someone, I beat them so far, probably a couple dozen times. There's a psychology to it. Can't explain that now. But anyway, it's not so don't let anybody tell you every game is logical. Every game is really kind of psychology. If you got an opponent, you're trying to figure out how they're going to play, you know. So by a couple years later, took these transistors and diodes. I had learned how to make gates. I had come across in my dad's that one manual that we still had in the house that I had discovered in a closet. Had a circuit that showed how the logic gates added up to make a little adder, one-bit adder, and how one-bit adder with a carry can lead to any number of bits you want. And then there was on another page a subtractor, and the circuits were so similar, and I looked at them, figured out a way to put in a couple gates of my own and a switch and make it an adder or a subtractor. So I built this thing up, hundreds of transistors on little boards, and I built the first adder, and it didn't work, and I'm testing with my scope, looking at the voltages, and figured out two resistors isn't really the best OR gate, because you attach that to a bunch of other things, and they feed back. You need diodes. So I actually solved that one myself. My dad didn't even solve it. So I was real proud of myself and got that computer all done for a junior high school project. But then while I was down at that science fair, I noticed a 9th grader had a project. And I'm trying to get closer and closer to what a computer is. I know how to build something that can add and subtract. You toggle in a 10-bit binary number and another 10-bit binary number, and you see 10 lights light up, and it's a binary answer. But that's not a computer, and I don't know what a computer is yet. I'm kind of shy and quiet. I don't really know a way to say to people, what is a computer? I stumbled on a project, and it was built based on a stepping relay, a stepping motor. And you'd set up a bunch of switches or dial in an instruction, just like, instruction, add these two registers, and then you dial in another instruction on another set of switches and another. They had a stepping motor, like clunk, 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 and it could go back on a loop. Clunk, 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 back, loop, clunk, 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 loop. Oh my God, that made so much sense to me. You know, when you're learning on your own by accident, you learn things real deeply. It has more meaning than if you just read it in a book. So that's what a computer does, a bunch of things, and then it goes back and redoes them. So anyway, so that was really cool. The next one I tried to design took me, about 10 sheets of paper, trying to design an adder with logic and some flip-flop type techniques that I'd learned that would somehow do over and over repeated stuff to be able to do a square root, kind of like you learn as a kid to do a square root, subtractions and division type stuff. And so that was just theoretical on paper, but I was kind of proud of it because it was so huge. In high school, I was good at math and science, and I was also interested in electronics. And very often you go into an electronics class back in those days when electronics was more popular or common, and you'd find a lot of shop-type people. It was a vocational course, and you didn't find that many really bright people. But the combination of math and electronics is engineering. And boy, our teacher was so good, Mr. McCollum. He wrote his own courseware. He wrote all the courses and the tests we do and the experiments, and he had his students in the early years build up test equipment. So we had lots of signal generators and scopes and voltmeters. We had a much better equipped high school electronics class in 1965-ish, 66-ish, than anywhere you could find, even like in local colleges. And he was so good. He had this big slide rule up there, and boy, I did so much slide rule calculation in electronics. And of course, you do slide rule calculations in chemistry and physics too. But boy, I got so good at using the slide rule because I had it all over the place, and loved being real fast and tricky on the slide rule. Well, I'd go to bed sometimes at night with a problem, a math problem, a design problem, something I was trying to design, or a class problem. In those days, go to bed thinking about it, wake up in the middle of the night and have a solution. It's happened frequently. Happened actually for a couple decades after that. It doesn't happen to me anymore. But it was kind of neat because I must have been dreaming about it or something. And one time I woke up and I went back to sleep. And in the morning I woke up and I knew that I'd waken up in the middle of the night with a solution, but I couldn't remember what it was. So I started having this rule, wake up, write it down. And then I woke up in the morning once and I looked at what I'd written down and it was some stupid thing I'd thrown out before anyway. So you don't necessarily dream good solutions. And we had an electronics club in the school. We were kind of non-social types, pretty nerdy. And, even though I was kind of like in sports, in track, but still more a nerd than anything else. Couldn't really talk to people well. Didn't feel comfortable talking to all the people that were out doing things I wasn't doing, partying and drinking and that kind of stuff. So we were kind of non-social in our club, and all the other clubs at Carnival Day had a standard place. They would buy little dinky, 5-cent gifts to give out as prizes at the carnival. We didn't even know how it worked, so we just went down to a local department store and bought a whole bunch of really great gifts. And we had, we sold the most tickets and made the most money and had all these great gifts. And I built this little device that had a little counter that counted up a number, and you push a button, and what the number comes up would determine what prize you got, if any. So that was kind of neat. It was like chance. It was like a game of gambling. But we just did it. You don't think about these things when you're young. Also in our booth, we put a couple little wires and hook a battery and release it to a coil and shock people whose clothes were even, sitting. It'll go right through the pants. So we used to have fun shocking people around our booths. It was that kind of a world. So electronics, it was for fun. We'd make little funny noisemakers and put them on the TVs of the school, and the teachers wouldn't know what they were, and the fact they had 27 batteries and would last for months didn't matter. Electronics was a way to have fun. It was an extra way to have fun if you didn't have a lot of the normal social outlets. A little way to have pranks. Pranks is good for that. So one time I built a little metronome, electronic metronome, and put it in a friend's locker. It's going tick, tick, tick. It had these big battery cells, kind of made to look like a bomb. But it was just a friend's locker, it's a joke. Unfortunately, he didn't hear it. The principal heard it. So I had to laugh when the principal told me how he opened up the locker, clasped it to his chest, and ran out and dismantled it, because I had rigged it with a resistor, so when you opened the locker, the ticking sped up. Whenever I kind of, go out and you come up with a funny idea, let's do something funny, I always try to take it one step further and have one extra little step of precision, and I could give tons of examples, but we don't have time for that. Anyway, playing with electronics, me and the electronics kids, we wired up and down our fences in the neighborhood and across the light poles. We found ways to get wires across. We had this big network intercom system, We'd buy batteries and microphones and speakers and that kind of stuff. And one time, it cut off from my friend way down the block. The signal, it cut off. It went away. Walked the fence and found that this one neighbor had cut the wire in about 100 places on the fence. So we ran it on the other side of the fence. We didn't know anything about property rights. You don't think about that. You just think there's a fence, you can run a wire. So, life was a lot easier back then. A lot of the things I did back then, I'd probably be put in prison for a few years now. Anyway, my electronics teacher saw that I kind of knew all the electronics in the school, and he said, well, you know what? You could go down to this company, an engineer will let you go down on Fridays and program a computer. Whoa. This is like the most prestigious thing could ever happen to a student. And I got to go down to Sylvania, and I got a Fortran book and started learning Fortran. First program was the Knight's Tour, and it never solved. And the next week I figured out it was working right. It just wasn't going to solve for 10 of the 25th years the way I wrote it. And that's when, it kind of leaves a little message that, the fact that a computer can do 1 million things a second doesn't mean it's as powerful as a person that has a better approach. While I was down at Sylvania, I saw a book, The Small Computer Handbook. And many, many of us remember that one. And the Small Computer Handbook, was a description of the PDP-8. And I liked it, and they said, oh, you can have this. I took it home, and I went through every page just in awe. I was mesmerized. Oh, my gosh, this is what a real computer is. I finally got a full formula. And meanwhile, my dad had some chip books that had the early chips, which were pretty much, they'd just gotten up to 1-bit adder on a chip. And maybe you could get 2 gates in a package, and it cost $100. So things were kind of expensive back then. But I looked at the two and started working on paper, all silently, all on my own, not with friends or parents or teachers, just started trying to figure out how I would design a computer. And I managed to design that computer, and then found out that I could get manuals to other mini computers of those days. And friends and I, we would drive down to Stanford Linear Accelerator Center on a Sunday, because there's a lot of bright people there, and wherever there's bright people, they leave doors open. And we'd be able to find a door open and get into the library and get computer magazines, and I would take out the cards to order the manuals. And they would send you manuals on computers and showing instruction sets and, just about down to schematics. And it was, and showing little program examples, and it was just so incredible. So every mini computer I could get, the Hewlett-Packard ones and the DEC ones and Varian and other companies, just sit down and I would design them. And then better chips came out. My dad gave me some better chip manuals. wow, and now I can do it in fewer chips than before. So I'd sit down some weekend and redesign a computer I'd already designed, trying to use fewer chips. And for some reason, in doing this for a couple of years in high school, I just got to the point that I always measured myself by how few chips I used. Eventually, I compared some Signetics chips versus some synchronous Fairchild TTL chips, and the Fairchild chips took more chips in my design, but they were smaller chips, and there were fewer connections. So I changed my rule to the smaller the board space, the better the design. And went out there. When you're competing with nobody but yourself, you have to you force yourself to say, I want to do a design better than I've done before. You come up with the most far-out tricks. You'll work for sometimes a week and come up with one little dinky trick that saves a chip, you know, or just uses the gates a little different order and saves one chip in the end. So that sort of became a goal of mine. No reason. I didn't have anyone telling me this is what you should do. It just seemed like a natural thing to do for fun on your own time, totally as a pastime. Well, so as I worked on this, all the mini computers back then, they were all, I mean, I saw a couple examples tonight that are almost in a different category, but they were generally rectangular boxes with a bunch of switches and a bunch of lights. And it looks pretty impressive and scary, but they're all just numbers if you think of it. And they look industrial. They look like something that goes inside of a company, you know, and it doesn't look like little hi-fis and things that you have in your home. Well, the Data General Nova came out. You know, and I looked, and it's kind of interesting, when they came out with a brochure introducing who was starting this company, really promoting the company and not the product, it was interesting. Back in those days, 1970, maybe 69, 68, the back page had an instruction set of the computer. Oh, my God, this was my life. This was my bread, you know. Wow, man, I've got to try and design one of those. So one day I finally got down to designing it, and their instruction was weird. Instead of having 50 different instructions, they had one long instruction word with a couple bits meant this, and a couple bits were this register, and a couple bits told it whether to which way to shift and how to use the carry. And in the end, it broke it into a lot of little chunks. And in my design, the instruction register had a couple little wires going to select a register here and a multiplexer, and a couple little wires to another multiplexer, and 3 wires down to the adder. And it turns out that it just fit the chips perfectly, and the design was half as many chips as I was used to. Okay, half as many chips for just as good a computer. So that means the architecture of a machine, matching the chips, can do the job a lot more efficiently. I fell in love with that computer. I told my dad, I'm going to own a 4K Nova someday so I can run Fortran. 4K Nova. He said, Steve, it costs about as much as a house. And I said, well, I'll live in an apartment. Someday, I was going to have a computer. Many others of us decided those along other routes of their own. Headed off to my first year at college. Boy, that was a lot of fun because there were very few colleges in those days that had computer science as a curriculum, undergraduate curriculum. So the courses were, the introduction to computers was a grad course at the University of Colorado. And I, as a freshman, I was in engineering, I was allowed to take it. So I took it, and I got my A+, but I also wound up getting put on probation for computer abuse. Actually, they called it abuse of computer time. And it turns out that all I'd done is run so many programs. I'd run programs and programs and programs to calculate numbers because I thought, wow, I finally get to program a computer for real. I'm going to open up my handbook of chemistry and physics and find some tables, and I'm going to write programs to calculate the first 60 pages, punch out some cards so I can run it again and calculate the next 60 pages and the next 60 pages, and I'll never overflow the time limit of the computer. And so 3 times a day I could turn around my punch card programs with 60 pages per 7 times 7 programs times 3 times a day, piling up reams of outputs in my dorm room. Unbelievable. And then I found out, well, there was one thing I didn't know, which is it's called accounting. I ran the class 5 times over its computer budget. So I was really meek back then, and the teacher scared me into thinking that if I went back to the campus, they were going to try to bill me. The computer department was going to bill me this, like, a year's tuition for computer use. And I was too scared to tell my parents, so I didn't want to pop back there the next year. But at the University of Colorado, I had a lot of fun. Had a little friend of mine, his father designed a TV jammer, so I'd buy these little transistors at Radio Shack and wind a coil and a transistor capacitor and a little 9-volt battery and hold it in my hand. He tuned in and jams a TV. So there was one color TV on campus. It was over in a girls' dorm, so I went downstairs in Libby's hall one night and sat in the back, and I turned on my jammer a little, and it only fuzzed the picture up a little. It didn't totally jam it. And so a friend of mine, oddly enough in the front row, decides to hit the TV. And I made it go good. So, yeah, everybody thinks we fixed it. That was fun. That was fun. And there was no planning this. So I jammed it again. He'd hit it again. Eventually, he'd have to hit it a little harder, but it would always fix it. And then finally, someone else started hitting it. For the next 2 weeks, it was kind of fun, like a psychology class, psychology research. And they'd station one person in a chair next to the TV, and whenever it went bad, it was his job to bang it and fix it. And after a while, they would fine-tune it, and it would go good, and they pull their hand away, and it goes bad. So I started getting a little finer with the techniques. Sometimes they'd tune some controls in the back, and the repairman would have to come in. They said, well, hey, the repairman said it's the antenna. So it went bad. They held the antenna up, and it went good. Put the antenna down, and it went bad. Okay? So then, eventually, holding it up, it went bad, so they climbed up on a chair. A guy held it way up, and then finally I made it so the TV would work if he stood on his toes, but not on his heels. And I guess I know that I wouldn't have the dexterity to do that well enough today, but I never got caught. Another time, 3 of them were up trying to fix the TV, and a guy had his hand on the middle of the screen, so I made it go good. And then they said, okay, it's good, relax, so we got it. And they all pulled their bodies away, and it went bad. And one guy in the back says, hey, get your bodies back where they were. Because by then they kind of knew that your body position mattered. And eventually the guy put his hand back on the screen, and it went bad. It went good. And then he pulled his hand away, and it went bad. And he had a foot up in the air on a chair, resting on a chair. He put his foot down on the ground, with his hand on the screen, put his foot down on the ground, and it went bad. And he put his foot back up on the chair, and it went good. He turned to the audience. He must have been an engineer. He said, it's a grounding effect. So they watched the last half of Mission Impossible with a hand on the middle of the TV screen. I wish we had small camcorders like we have today. Took that TV jammer, built it into a magic marker, and took it to my class. Because in the class, some people got to see the class live, and the rest of us had to watch it in an overflow room on a TV set. So I took it in, and I kind of turned on the jammer, and it didn't jam the sets very well because they were cable TV. Jammed one over on the right more than the others, and the one above me didn't even get jammed hardly at all. Weird. 3 guys, big guys in the front of class stood up, and I said, oh my God, I didn't think there were any teachers in here. I was just going to turn it on and turn it off. And now I was too scared. They started saying, turn off the transmitter. Yeah, I'm going to reach over and turn it off and get caught. Right. So I'm sitting here thinking, they're watching us, the whole class, like hawks, and I'm thinking, how am I going to ever, turn it off? I said, well, I'll just walk out with everyone else. They won't know. Finally, near the end of class, a guy under the TV that was jammed the worst starts gathering his books to leave a little early. So as he's walking to the door, I made the TVs flutter. And he walked out the door, they went perfect. And one of the TAs points like that. And later I heard that he said, there he goes. So I learned it's really funny if you do prank and you make it look like someone else did it. You get 2 for 1. Next year, I didn't want to pay that big bill or tell my parents about it at the computer center at University of Colorado on their 6600. So I went to De Anza, and my friend Larry Platzik had somehow had a key to the computer room. And we would go in at midnight or 1 and open it up and start up the computer and the printers and the disk drives and the different parts and run program through on decks of cards and sit there with printouts and correct them and rerun them all night long. We did that for a long time. And took a lot of classes at the end that didn't even count towards my transfer credit to Berkeley because I liked computers so much. Just liked programming them. Anything having to do with them. No real reason. Didn't really think I'd be doing that as a job, but maybe. Okay, so I'm still designing mini computers, and my designs are getting better and better, and I'm competing with myself still. Now I took a year off from college, and I went to work for a year programming for a company. I was enjoying it so much, I just took a year off from college, and the company went broke. Tenet went broke. They had a neat, medium-sized computer in those days, and disk drives, and they had an operating system, and they had several languages working, and it was like a beautiful system, and the assembly language was gorgeous. And I'm thinking, well, how can you have a good computer and go bankrupt? You make a good product, you sell it, you make a lot of money. That's how it's done. Well, it was a recession. And it's like the investors didn't want to put the money into it and trust it and all that. I could never understand that, how a company could have a successful product and still go out of business. So that was a tough one. Anyway, around that time, one of the guys at that company knew some people in the silicon industry. And even though I did a lot of designs on paper of mini computers, I could never get the parts to build one. So he said, yeah, design a computer. I'll get you some parts from Signetics. So I sat down and designed a very minimal computer, almost like your first computer design class, where you go into what's the minimum computer you can make that actually computes. Designed a very, very simple one with very few chips on one little tiny board and needed 8 RAMs. He came up with 8 RAMs. He got the parts given to me. This is the first time in my life. So I built this little computer and took a couple of weeks building it, drinking cream sodas at night, and we called it the cream soda computer. And Bill Fernandez, who helped wire it up in his garage, and it worked, had switches and lights and that kind of input, and you could toggle the byte into the switches and push a button, and it goes into an address register, and toggle the bytes and push a button, and it gets stored into that memory location. So it was really a computer. That was all it mattered. It couldn't do anything useful. He introduced me to Steve Jobs. And Steve Jobs, you know, he was interested in pranks and electronics. That's what we had in common. He'd done some pranks at the high school, and he understood electronics and counters and that sort of thing and those kind of signals and appreciated it. He was a little more of a hippie than I. You know, my dad had kind of taught me about the extremes of politics, and I always wanted to be in the middle. And he was just, you know, kind of have nothing and just a few nuts to eat and, you know, bare feet and wander, you know. And a lot of people are like that at that age. So it was kind of interesting. But when we got together and we talked pranks, we talked music too. We loved the same kind of music for the same reasons. I headed off to my third-year college at Berkeley, taking all computer courses. Boy, did I have a schedule nobody could compare to. I had 2 classes on Monday and Wednesday and 2 classes on Tuesday and Thursday. All 4 of those classes were in the same room. They all followed each other. So I'd go to the room and sit through it for 2 classes every day of the week, all those 4 days. And I had no class before, I think, 2 in the afternoon. So, beat that one. A couple of days before I left for Berkeley, I picked up an Esquire magazine. It had this little article about another technical device called The Secrets of the Little Blue Box, Fiction by Ron Rosenblum. This turned out to be the most accurate, truthful article ever written, but it was called Fiction. Halfway through it, I'm reading about these guys like Captain Crunch that somehow know each other and set up networks on telephone lines for free all over the country and bring other people into their networks, and they take over cities, and they run this whole thing because they're so smart, and they run it out of racks of equipment in vans that drive around switching equipment. These guys are the brightest engineers there are. I'm halfway through the article, and I called Steve Jobs up, and I started reading the sections that described people like Captain Crunch and some of the techniques they used to make free phone calls, and then I said, the trouble is, this is just too real. It just doesn't sound like fiction. Why would they give these exact frequencies? So we went down to Slack Library the next day, and we started pulling out books, and we finally found a book, and it had a list of frequencies that matched the ones in the article, and now we had the whole list. So that took us into a fun year of some rather astounding discoveries. Anyway, the night we actually... Much harder to do than learn how to build a little blue box and play with it. I had this principle that we both did. We would only tell our parents what we did. We both told them. They said, don't make any of those calls from our phone. When we finally got beyond an analog box to a digital, that the frequencies were stable enough, and it worked, we made 1 call on his phone, then we drove up to the dorm. From then on, we wouldn't use them at home. We obeyed our parents' rules. I told my parents about it. You know, they didn't like it, but they appreciated the fact that at least I told them what I was doing, that I felt it was right, and that even if we got caught, we were young enough to get it kind of a wrist slap and all this other thinking. So we had these devices, and I never used them to save money on phone calls. I felt I was going to be an ethical hacker. I just liked to build these things to show off the fact I could build them. But looking back, I helped other people that just used them to make free phone calls. So I wasn't that pure. But I called myself an ethical hacker anyway. So we had quite a fun year doing that at Berkeley and the phone. But the night I met Captain Crunch, before the FBI even knew who he was, this was amazing to run into him through a couple of connections and people passing some words on and some radio station interviews he'd done in our area. Met him that night. Oh, he gave us so many codes late at Berkeley, and then had to drive back home with Steve Jobs. So we got a blue box. And it's the first time we're ever going to try it on a payphone because his car broke down in Hayward. And we got to call back to the dorm and get a ride with Crunch back to his house and all this stuff. So we're sitting at the payphone trying to make a blue box call, and the operator comes back on the line, and we're all scared. And we try it again, this ruse about a data call, and she comes back on the line, and we're all scared, so we put in money. And then a cop car pulls up, and Steve was shaking, you know, and he got the blue box back into my pocket. He got it to me because the cop turned to look in the bushes for drugs or something, you know, so put the box in my pocket. The cop pats me down and says, "What's this?" I said, "It's electronic music synthesizer." Wasn't too musical. Second cop says, "What's the orange button for?" "It's for calibration," says Steve. You know, well, yeah, we were caught. So the cops said, what's the problem? Our car broke down. Where is it? Out in the freeway. So we got in the cop car, and the cops are holding the blue box. Cop in the passenger seat turns around and hands me the box, and he says, a guy named Moog beat you to it. You can't, you know what, you can't make up stories like that good. So anyway, I crashed my own car that night, fell asleep on the freeway driving back, and totaled my car. So the next year, I decided I'll take another year off from college to earn the money for my fourth year. I'd taken a year off to earn money for my third year. I'll take a year off to earn money for my fourth year. And that's when my career started going up and never got back for 10 years. But at least I did go back and get my degree finally. Anyway, after about half a year at a very fun job as an electronics technician, you know, and I was up to just about the point of helping the designers out solving their most difficult problems in the place, a friend of mine worked in the HP calculator division, Alan, who's here, and he got them to interview me, and oh man, they hired me to design calculator chips. Oh my God, this was the most incredible product in the world, the HP 35, the one that put slide rules out of business. And I got to work designing these products now, my favorite product in the world. I actually owned one. I think it was paid for with Blue Box monies. Because it was pretty expensive, $400 back then for a college student. I actually got to design the product that I loved and the company that I loved. My father had always taught me how Hewlett-Packard made the finest engineering equipment, you know, with better standards than other companies had. And this was just like, how could you believe that? It must be like people who just love an Apple computer and get to work for Apple someday. So I'm working at Hewlett-Packard, and I pretty much got out of computers. You know, calculators was a different world. So my interest in computers lapsed a bit, but I still loved electronics on the side. So normally you come home from work at engineering and you just want to sit down at the TV, you know, and watch the World Series. I would just come home and work on more electronics projects of my own. One of my favorite things, I started the first dial-a-joke in the whole Bay Area because I always appreciate humor a lot. Got a lot of values from my dad, but my mom and my sister, me, humor. So I started the first dial-a-joke back before you could buy an answering machine, before you could buy a telephone. So it wasn't very easy to do. It was like much harder to do than starting a company. And I ran this number, and anybody who had a similar number got 100 wrong calls a day, so I'd switch the number. And then more people would be complaining about getting all these wrong calls every day, because I got 2,000 calls a day on one line number with one answering machine. Short little jokes. I tried to make them real short, like 15 seconds, so I could get that many through. I said, the kid's got to dial an easy number. Phone company, can you give me 2555555 in Cupertino? No, we don't assign on the 5 bank. Can you give me 2556666? I checked it out, it's free. I said, yeah, we'll give it to you. So I got my first good number with repeating digits, 2556666. And basically, it was getting into this interest in phone numbers with repeating digits is why we priced the Apple I at $666.66. And we'd never heard of 666 in the Bible, so. Anyway, so one of my side projects was starting Dial-A-Joke, and boy, that was amazing. I even met my first wife there, you know. It was like you had a chat room where you were anonymous. I was Stanley Zebrzuskanitsky. Heard a good one lately? Hello, thank you for dialing Dial-A-Joke. Probably somebody in this room called the thing. I also got into designing a home pinball game for a guy in one state, and got to designing, you know, got into the CartterVision VCR. This was before Betamax. Incredible VCR, and they had a duplicating factory in San Jose, and they had thousands of these machines, and they were selling them for $60 each, color VCRs, back when a black and white cost a school $1,000. For $60, you run down with some engineers, you buy this, doesn't have a case on it, like a wooden case or anything, but it's a color VCR, and even had a little button for a dial for a timer. Unbelievable to luck into this thing. I would take groups of engineers down from Hewlett-Packard. We'd buy a bunch of these and start studying them and, you know, going through and repairing a few of the power supplies transistors when they burned out. And so I got a little reintroduction back to my high school television and how VCRs worked and, you know, the various circuitry involved with video stuff. Then one day I saw I got involved in the first hotel movie systems doing the digital part of it. So that was a real lucky break, too. And these were just all accidents that came my way. But I was in a bowling alley. And I remember which bowling alley and exactly where I was standing with my fiancée. And there was a Pong game. And this little game is on a TV screen with a ball bouncing back and forth. And oh my God. And I was mesmerized. And I said, I can design one of those. Because I know how to design digital logic. And I know how television signals work from high school. So I sat down and designed my first Pong, and eventually Steve Jobs was working at Atari sometime, and they brought me in, looked at my Pong game. I had a little switch, so if you missed the ball, it gave a little 4-letter epithet if you wanted. Well, we didn't have very big proms in the lab back then. We had 4-bit by 256. So you had to have 2 of these TTL prom chips to make 256 bytes. These were earlier days, so it was hard to have a little program in something, but that's where I programmed the words. Anyway, I got this job to design Breakout. Had to do it in 4 days and deliver a working prototype. 4 days and nights, Steve and I spent up all night long down to Atari. I designed it as fast as I could, and if we get paid a certain amount for 50 chips or 40 chips, and we're there late at night. We both got mononucleosis. We finished it up by the last day. I think they couldn't understand my design and why it worked and what they'd have to do to extend it a little, so they didn't quite go ahead and use it. But shortly after that, I walked into my old friend, Captain Crunch. I don't know if I think he'd been like arrested a couple of times by then, but not to prison yet, you know. So I went to his basement in Cupertino, and he's sitting there typing on a big teletype machine. You know, teletypes were real expensive, $1,000, could never afford one of those. He's typing away, and he says, I'm playing checkers or chess on a computer in Boston at MIT. And then he says, watch this, I'll switch computers to Stanford. And he was on the ARPANET. And this was like one of those little insights. You can do that? That was just so amazing. I said, oh my God. Well, you know what? Well, I know how to put characters on a screen, and I'll just design a circuit to be a terminal. I got to get a keyboard. Search the magazines, and they had a terminal available for $60. Okay, $60 in 1974, whatever. That's like how many dollars today? It's $300 just for a keyboard. A keyboard. I need a keyboard. $60, and it was uppercase only, but it worked. It was a teletype replacement. And I designed this little terminal, and I said, I don't have an output device. I can't afford a $1,000 teletype. I can't afford a video monitor, but I have a TV set. I have a Sears TV, and back in those days, TV sets came with schematics. So you open it up, and you find out where to tap in the wires. You look at the signals on a scope, and they're inverted, and you put a transistor inverter circuit, and wait. So use the home TV, and I had this little terminal, and I could borrow a modem at first, and then design my own modem, and we dial into Stanford. My gosh, I'm on the ARPANET. Never really used it for much, but it was so neat to know that you could get around the world on a computer network. Well, my friend came by, and you know, I'd been a few years away from my mini-computer background. I hadn't really known that microprocessors had even happened. Really hadn't heard the word. And Alan came by and said, there's a club starting up, and he didn't say it's a computer club or a microprocessor club because I would have been too scared to go, to tell you the truth. He said it's for people that have terminals and things. And I had just built this great terminal. I said, oh my gosh, I can show it off. So how cool. So I went to the first meeting of the Homebrew Computer Club, and I felt very out of place. They had this little computer kit on the front of a magazine cover, and it was a square rectangular box with a bunch of binary switches and lights, just like the old mini computers, but it was kind of affordable. It was like cheap, like $400, and then if you want to get more than 256 bytes, you start paying more money. It's like a human can actually afford to buy these things. You build it yourself. It was called the Altair. It had been on a magazine cover. I hadn't heard the first thing about it. I hadn't heard about the Mark 8 that had been on a magazine cover. So I felt very awkward, like, oh boy, this is not my place. I've got to get out of here. And then they passed around a data sheet for a microprocessor, the Intel 8080 or the 8008 from a Canadian company or something. And I went home that night and I studied what a microprocessor was. And I said, wait a minute, that's just like the processor of a mini computer. I know this stuff. Oh, I'm back in business. I'm back with the thing I love. I'm going to actually have that computer I want someday in my life. Okay, next problem was, what kind of microprocessor do you use? Intel had high prices. It's going to, oh my gosh, $370 for a microprocessor? I could never think of affording that very easily. I found out that HP employees could buy a Motorola 6800 for $40. So I designed my circuit on the Vellum. I designed it for the 6800 with some RAM and to attach to my terminal that already existed because it had a keyboard and it had a television set for display. And then the 6502 microprocessor got introduced by a company in Pennsylvania. And this was like the newest, latest, greatest, and it had all these neat, tricky addressing modes, and it was missing things like increment instructions. Is it better? Is it worse? Is it the same? It's about a wash. And it was $20. They were going to sell it at Westcon Show in San Francisco, over the counter. Walk up. See, how could you buy a microprocessor back in those days? If you were a person, you couldn't buy one. There were no stores. There were no electronic stores that carried microprocessors or chips or that kind of stuff. You had to go to some distributor and fill out all these forms that made it sound like you had credit. You know, you had to fill out a credit reports, and it was very awkward and uncomfortable. So they were going to sell one for cash over the counter. So I went to Westcon. A lot of people did. Paid $20 over the counter, got a 6501. Paid $25, you got a 6502, which had a little bit of clocking circuitry built in. You didn't need to have your own clocking transistors. and paid $5 more, got a manual, took it home, and boy, that was my chip. It was pin for pin compatible with the 6800, and that's what my design had been. Finally sat down, go down to my cubicle night after night after night at Hewlett-Packard and plan out where each chip would be, and then solder every wire exactly the right distance between pins. No spare wire, no wire wrap stuff, didn't want it to look ugly. And got this whole board down, and it was working. And I plugged in a memory board. I plugged in some static RAM that I bought, and it worked. Okay, and well, to make it work, I said, well, hold on. Every computer in the past that I've seen has been this big rectangular box with a bunch of binary switches and binary lights. And somehow they have ways you can attach teletypes to them. Not that you could ever afford one. And I said, but you know, at Hewlett-Packard, we got our calculators. And the calculators are human. And they got buttons that say 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. You know, and you push and there's a little program running saying, wait for a key to get pressed. And you press the 5 button, and the 5 program runs and does the right thing. And you press another key, the plus key, and it goes and runs a routine for plus. I said, why don't I just write a little program for this microprocessor that powers up saying, wait for a key to get pressed. And when the user presses a key, it has to do 3 things. The things that all these switches and lights would do on the big commercial mini computers, they would store data into memory, they would examine what's in a memory location, and they would run a program at a certain address. Had to do those 3 things. So wrote a little 256-byte program to do just that much. And it worked, called a monitor. So just you power up this computer, it starts reading from a human keyboard, not switches and lights, a human keyboard, and you type in hexadecimal what you would have set switches for. So it has to be just as good as any other computer, but it's a lot slicker, and it's smaller, and it has almost no parts, and it has a human keyboard, and a person can really use it. And so this was the computer that I was developing, and I got it working and started showing it off at the club a little. And then Steve Jobs came to the club, and he saw it, said, whoa, there's a lot of people interested in this what you got. You know, people would come up and ask me questions. I'd be sitting there with my Sears TV on a table demonstrating it. And he said, you know, why don't we make a PC board for $20, and then we'll sell it for $40. And it might cost us, you know, so many $100 to lay out a PC board. He has a friend that could do that at Atari. And, you know, we're driving along, and I thought, I don't know if we'll sell enough down at the club to get our money back. We'd have to sell 50 of them. And he says, well, what if we never get our money back? We still have a company. We can say we had a company. Well, of course, when you're young, you'll do that, you know? In other words, yeah, if you go into it, not saying you have to justify it by getting your money back, you're doing it because it's something you want to do. So that's pretty much how we got started. Now, Steve introduced me to this guy, Ron Wayne, and he became our 3rd partner. Ron Wayne had 10% of the partnership, and Steve had 45%, and I had 45%. And we both trusted Ron to solve any questions. Ron was just a real absolutist right-winger, you know, read all those books, None Dare Call It Treason, and those kind of books. And boy, but he had just real stern answers to every little thing instantly. And he would sit down and type out a legal document with all the legalese writing, and he wasn't a lawyer. And that's how we formed the company. And he drew this beautiful sketch of Newton under the apple tree, and that became our Apple I manual. So Ron had a lot of talents. Well, anyway, I went to Hewlett-Packard. Well, first, I figured anything I designed belongs to Hewlett-Packard. So I went to Hewlett-Packard, and I wanted them to do this product. And we were in the right division. I sat down with the division manager 3 levels above me and my boss and some others and proposed that we make this $800 machine that will run BASIC on your home TV. And he had a few technical reasons, and it was your TV and a Hewlett-Packard computer and some problems like that, and he didn't have the resources available, and he turned it down. But for weeks and months after that, he'd see me in elevators and say, Steve, I haven't been able to sleep since I heard that idea of a little computer that can run BASIC in your home. So it was like a good deal, but it wouldn't make a Hewlett-Packard product. Well, Steve, we're driving along, so we decided we'll start the company, and Steve said, let's call it Apple Computer. He came up with that idea. He would go up to Oregon and work on orchards, you know, with his bare feet for a while, and then come back home and work for Atari for a while. Very free type existence. And I always assumed, I'm not a person that asks questions, and Steve's not a person that gives a lot of where he gets his ideas from when they're suggested by others, but I always assumed that they had apple trees in that orchard. My best guess. Well, the biggest financial shock in Apple's history was about to hit. I'm still working at Hewlett-Packard, and we've got this design, and we've laid out a PC board, and I sold my most valuable possession, my HP 65 calculator, but I sold it for $500, and next month we were coming out with the HP 67, and I could buy the employee price $370. So you can't quite call it really a big sacrifice. Steve called me up, and he said, you sitting down? I said, what? He says, just got a $50,000 order. Up till then, we were going to sell boards for $40, and if we get a few $100 back, we're lucky. $50,000. Oh my God. I mean, that's like business. That's scary. It turns out there was one store in the whole South Bay area in Palo Alto, the Byte Shop, and they wanted to buy 100 computers for $500 each. That's better be 50,000. And what they did was they were buying kits right now, and people come in the store and want to buy a completely built computer. We had a nice small one-board computer that we could get wave soldered for $13 and have it completely built almost. At least the board is completely built. You know, maybe you have to plug on a keyboard and transformers and a case, or the store has to deal with that. But it's a lot less work than they were used to, and they could sell it as a completely built computer to all these people that were coming in. I'm interested in buying a computer. I'm interested in buying a computer. So now that we had kind of a real order and some real money, I felt a little guilty, so I contacted HP's legal department, and they searched every division to make sure there was no interest in any product like this, so I didn't want to step over that bounds. We had this Apple I, and we started selling it, and we built it. These were the days you hear about called the garage, and we actually had Steve's parents' house. Although I did all my designs in my cubicle at work and my apartment in Cupertino, we did our final assembly in the garage. Steve would drive down to a place in Santa Clara and bring back our finished boards of the Apple I. And we'd put them on a bench in the garage and hook them up to a scope. I would do this and look at some, and it would work or it wouldn't. Start typing. If it doesn't work, I'd start looking for, you know, lines that were shorted or traces that were open because a pin didn't go into the socket right. And that's what we did in the garage. We did the final assembly, got things working. Then we'd take the good boards, put them in some white boxes, and after we had 25 of them, Steve would drive them down to the Byte Shop and get paid in cash. The deal that he worked out was we got 30 days credit on the component parts, on all the chips and everything. 30 days net. So as soon as the PC boards got made, the chips came out of a closet, they got inserted in a few days, we drove them back to our garage, tested them, drove them down to the store, and we got paid cash. And we could cycle it in 10 days, and we had 30 days credit, because we had no money at all. And it worked. We had no lawyers to slow things down. I'm sure disaster would have hit. So we're doing that, and then at a certain point, Ron Wayne sort of realized Steve Jobs had no money, and I had no money at all, no assets of any sort. And Ron had his gold nuggets in between his mattresses. And he was afraid that if anything went wrong and we didn't get paid, he was the one they were going to collect from. So he sold out his 10% of Apple for a few $100. But for a reason, could have been a good reason. Anyway, so I'm still at Hewlett-Packard while we're selling these Apple I's. I mean, that's just sort of on the side. We're not selling too many. We might have built 200 of them, sold 150 total over a year. And we're getting our name known in a few of these new little hobbyist journal magazines about little computers. And that motivates you. You know, when people always reckon we were at the top of every list because they were alphabetic order and we were Apple. And people always noted the Apple had pretty good price. We had pretty good price and specs, you know, and we had a neat little thing that was really different than the other products. Well, I started work and I designed the Apple I with the intent of adding color to it, using a little technique that popped in my head when I was down at the Atari Labs for 4 days and nights doing Breakout. I was just thinking, you know, about this little technique of generating color just by cycling data at color frequency in a register. Maybe that would work. And pulled it out, and I designed the Apple I for it. But as I started trying to add chips onto the Apple I, add a feature, came up with an idea to shrink this down and make it smaller. And then rather than have the sequence of stuff to generate the RAM timing, I think I'll just combine a little state machine with a register and a PROM. And then, oh no, searching every book I could, every book on chips, found a little shift register with the feedback control that I could just one chip generate all the timing for the random access memory, the dynamic RAMs. By the way, the reason for dynamic RAMs in the Apple products was very simple. My rule in a product was the fewest chips or the fewest board spaces, the better it was. Well, you know what? It was every single hobby computer that came out, every single one of them. Go down a list of 30 of them. Every one used static RAMs because they were designed probably not by real engineers as much as by just technicians that like this stuff. And you can run the wires, the address pins from a microprocessor to the RAMs, and the data pins from the microprocessor to the RAMs, and you're done, and it works. You know, and I sat there, and the 4K dynamic RAM was about to come out. The first RAM denser than core memories. The first RAM cheaper than core memories. Okay, the start of putting core memories out of business. The 4K dynamic RAM. If I had 8 of those chips, that's 4K bytes, which is what I wanted. 8 chips. How many chips would it take with the static RAMs, the 2104s or whatever they were called? They were only 1K chips, 1K bits. So you'd have to have 32 of them. 32 chips. I can reduce that down to 8 chips. Now, sure, I have to put in a little sneaky multiplexing of some data that came off of my video counters to do some address, to refresh them and keep them alive. But it turns out that, so you add 5 chips back in, you've already saved 24. So it was so much smaller to use the dynamic RAMs. The first ones I got were a type from AMI. There were some from MOSTEC, and there were some from Intel. 3 types got introduced that year, 1975. And the ones from Intel were a little better. They were TTL compatible. They kind of had a little bit of trickier 2 steps of addressing, but they were the smaller package. And Steve called me up and said, well, what about the Intel ones? And I said, well, they're the best, but you know what, I can never afford anything from Intel. And he said, oh, let me work on it. So he got 16 the next day. So that's why we went with the right RAM. Lucky coincidences, not necessarily totally planned. Well, the Apple II, as I started working on this design to get the color in, clever ideas, and the RAM timing came down, and then eventually it wound up being half as many chips with 10 times the capability. I mean, it had color, and whoever thought of color in a day when it wasn't being done anywhere else, except you could buy plug-in boards that had 50 chips on them, more than our whole Apple II anyway, and it had the dynamic RAM, and it had graphics. Graphics, oh my gosh, well, what can you do with graphics? Well, I don't know, breakout, you can draw color patterns. It had high-resolution graphics. Didn't even know. There's one case I didn't know if it was going to be worth anything, and Steve said, well, what does it cost? I said, 2 chips. He said, well, put it in. And I really did want it in there. It kind of made sense. But then, and we wound up with paddles and sound, and the I.O., back in those days, you'd plug a board in. The board, you would dial in an address. It would compare the address to the address line with a whole bunch of chips, comparison chips, and it was just every board you plugged in had a whole bunch of circuitry and some switches. And I said, wait a minute, just pre-decode it. One little multiplexer chip or decoder chip just spans out and drives 8 sockets with some addresses. Gave them each socket, I think I gave 3 sets of addresses, so had plenty of addresses, and you just plug a board in, and it works when it gets the right enable. The enables were to each chip. So it was so many clever things happened at once. It wasn't just one thing. With the Apple I, the biggest part of the project was once I finished the computer, it could sit there and I could tell people it's a computer and I can type hexadecimal on it and type some data into memory and see what's there. But instantly I said, what do I want to do my whole life? I want to run Fortran or a higher level language. And I sniffed the air, and it turned out that BASIC was the one to go with. BASIC was out for the Altair, the Bill Gates BASIC. I mean, the Homebrew Computer Club was something else. It was Dan Sokol was the guy who copied their BASIC tape all those times and got the bad reaction from Bill Gates. But so BASIC, but you know what? There were books out with BASIC games. And what do people want to do if they have their own computer? You want to type in some games and play them. Now, I had 2 goals. I wanted to play games, but I also wanted to type in some simulations for my logic designs at Hewlett-Packard. So I had 2 basic goals, and I sat down. I had never used BASIC in my life. So I opened up the Hewlett-Packard BASIC manual and started writing down the syntax, which parts of it I wanted and which parts I didn't need. And I had this goal to get the first BASIC done for the 6502 because I was real shy and wasn't outspoken, couldn't speak to people in those days. But, God, I loved doing things first. And there were no BASIC out for the 6502 yet. I'd have the first one if I really rushed on it. And I worked and worked and worked. And I'd never written a language, never really taken a course in it. I'd read a few books or parts of books that had been Xerox sent to me by my friend Alan Baum, and came up with a clever approach to where in the end I could take every single symbol in my syntax table and write a routine for that. So just write a small routine, write a small routine, write a small routine, chunking out the routines day by day by day, and the basic language finished itself. And I could go down to this computer club and show off a little skinny board, the Apple II, very few chips, running BASIC. Whoa, in text only. And then the Apple II, we had color. Well, I got this weird idea in my head. When I was down at Atari doing Breakout, they were building their first microprocessor game, whatever that meant. And they're going to program it. And I guess you program it in assembly language, which was, what I was most familiar with. And I said, I can program a game like Breakout on my Apple II. But then I said, I wonder if I could write it in BASIC, the easy-to-use language for anyone. This is a goal. And really, it led a lot to adding the different graphics, to adding paddles, to adding the sound, the things that a game needed in almost no chips every time to the board, adding some commands in the BASIC to set color and draw some short little segments and do that sort of stuff. And eventually, and so I finally got to the point that I thought I had enough to write the game. I sat down and I wrote this pattern to put some bricks on the screen in color. I didn't like the colors, and I changed it, and and then I changed it again and changed it again, and kind of changed the position and the size and the placement, and then the paddle changed its size, and got a ball going around, picked out some angles and speeds, and just changed the program. And in half an hour, I had done what would have taken easily 5 years in hardware, back when the designs were hardware, like Breakout. And I was just shaking. I called Steve Jobs over. I was just shaking. I said, Steve, games are never going to be the same now that they're programs. It was a real eureka moment. So anyway, so now we've got a real good-looking computer, this Apple II. And what happened was, by the way, my company, Hewlett-Packard, by then, had started a small computer project in our lab called Capricorn. It was kind of on the other half of the side of the lab. So I went to the head guy of it, and I said, look, Chung, I'm not really interested in calculators. My interest in life is computers, and I really want to work on this machine. They're building a machine, and they had guys assigned to develop printer interfaces, which I'd already done on the Apples, and they had the cassette interface or tape interface, and I'd already done a cassette interface, and they were doing, a dynamic RAM and a microprocessor, which I'd done, and they had 5 guys writing a BASIC, and I'd just written one, and I said, I'll do anything. I'll do a printer interface. I'll do anything. I just want to work on that project. And 2 weeks later, they turned me down. Don't ask me why. My own lab. I've never been able to answer that one to this day. But I guess it was lucky, sort of. Anyway, we had a product that looked hot. The Apple I had been the first one of these small computers at low cost for the real people, that had a keyboard, a human keyboard. The second one to come out was from a group in our homebrew computer club. The Processor Technology Sol computer had a keyboard and a little black and white display and some little neat capabilities in it. And it was now selling like 1,000 a month. It was the hot product in the country, and stores were opening up in cities. Computer stores were opening up, so they were going in. They were the big hot winner. We knew we could sell 1,000 a month of this Apple II, and each one cost $250 to build. How do you build 1,000 computers? You need $250,000, and we had nothing. We went to Commodore, and I was kind of embarrassed because Steve was asking Commodore for hundreds of thousands of dollars, it sounded like, and I'm thinking, what do you mean? It's just a design. And we went to Atari, and they liked it, but they had their hands full coming out with their first home Pong, and they turned it down. And then eventually we met people in the garage, and they'd say, well, what's your market for it? And I'd say, it's 1 million units. They said, how do you know that? I said, well, this is Don Valentine I told us to. I said, well, computers are bigger than ham radio, and there's a million ham radios. Well, who could deny that? Anybody can see that. But it wasn't really, it wasn't schooled words. So anyway, we eventually ran into Mike Markkula, and he basically became interested and worked with Steve night after night, kind of defining what the market was going to be like. It was computers for home things, basically doing recipes and keeping tracks of songs on databases and writing your checkbook. And these are real things that people do in the home. And it was hard to say it was a large market. It didn't sound, that big, but that's what we were starting. And he was willing to put in $250,000 and own a third of the company, equal to Steve and I. And I had to leave. Finally, he told me, you'll have to leave Hewlett-Packard. And I said, wait a minute. I've designed 2 computers. I've written a BASIC, designed all these interfaces and peripherals in a year, and I did it moonlighting. Why can't I keep my secure job for life at Hewlett-Packard? I decided I wanted to be an engineer for life and never get into the political side of companies. And why can't I keep my secure job and just do this on the side? No, you got to decide. You got to leave Hewlett-Packard. And there was a date in February. We had to meet in his cabana and give my answer. Went up to that cabana. I thought and searched inside and went up to the cabana and I said, no, I like designing computers and I like writing neat software and I can do that anyway, but I'm going to keep my job at Hewlett-Packard. He says, okay. And Steve went into a frenzy and got all my friends, my parents to call me. And finally, one person called, Alan actually, and one person called and convinced me that it was okay to start a company. You didn't have to feel like running it. I was too embarrassed. I just didn't feel like it. I didn't talk the way Steve and Mike spoke. They spoke about, the markets and a lot of business terms, and I just wanted to design products. And I would just be swamped and have no place in a company running it. And I was scared, actually, of that. And I just got he convinced me that another person said it's okay to be an engineer and nothing else and just start the company to make money. So that's what I did. And I quit Hewlett-Packard that day. And it was a big deal to give up my job, the company that I loved so much back then. In the early days of these personal computers, the Apple II came out, and we were so different. We had color, we had good keyboards, we had graphics and sound and expandability, and eventually we could add things like floppy disks. The PET, the Commodore PET and the TRS-80 were the other two completely built, out of the box, ready for the home user computers. And they sold for a lot less. They didn't cost a lot less to build, especially when they came with a monitor and everything, TV monitor built in. But they were out there, and eventually it came time that, well, we wrote a bunch of programs. We wrote all our programs were on cassette tapes. One program was a flashcard program, and largely inspired by Mike Markkula, who had a lot of experience with young kids and had a 9-year-old daughter at the time. And we wrote a checkbook program. But it took a couple of minutes to read the checkbook program in off a cassette tape. And then it took a couple of minutes to read your checks in. And then you modify one, and it takes a couple of minutes to write them back out. It's kind of a long, boring procedure that really isn't satisfactory. So we needed a couple of things, and one of them was we needed a floppy disk drive for speed. And I had never been close to a floppy disk drive or a floppy disk controller or any of those designs, but, you know, I kind of knew what sort of signals you got to put into something to, you know, write onto magnetic tape and get it back out. So I sat down, you know, one weekend and started working on an idea I'd had back at Hewlett-Packard with this new 8-bit shift register chip, and just put this little scheme together to read and write data, and it was like 5 chips. And then I called in a friend, and we worked every day. We had this deal where we could go to CES if we got it done in time. And so we came in every day, including Christmas and New Year's Day. Randy Wigginton, a high school programmer, was doing this with me. And he was doing the programming, and we brought it up, and we got it to the point we could actually read and write tracks of data. And we had this thing working. And then I said, well, it's not a disk controller. It can read and write data, but it's not a disk controller because disk controllers have 50 chips. And it just doesn't have enough chips to be a disk controller. I don't know what they do. So I got a disk controller from a company, Northstar or someone, and I went through their manual, and I looked at their schematic and started figuring out how their schematic worked. And in the end, I figured out that mine actually did more than theirs did with fewer parts. And also, it was kind of neat to just take the Shugart board. They wanted all these signals coming in a certain structured way, bypassed all their chips, and said, let's just send the signals straight over to the motor drivers and skip all that. Skipped like 15 of their chips and cut our board down to 8 chips in the end once we had track stepping and all. Now, one night, you know, by that time Apple was a little larger company. We were having a lot of success. And I went over to the engineering department. I said, who lays out the PC boards? Well, that company was kind of busy this week doing another board, you know, a serial card or something. And I said, great, I'll lay it out myself. You know, you just want to do that. So I got the clear plastic and the red tape and started taping together, you know, putting down chip layouts and putting the tape in place. Finished the thing, and I worked every night. I'd work till 2, 3, 4 in the morning. The 2 Houston brother technicians would leave at 2, and I'd still be there at 3. And, man, we had one staff meeting, and Steve Jobs turned to me and said, Woz, you're coming in at noon every day. You're coming in late, you know. Yeah. So anyway, I got all done with this layout of a PC board, the first one I ever done in my life. And I realized by this point in time that I would have had 3 fewer crossovers where you have to put a hole through the board and cross something over. 3 fewer crossovers on this 2-sided PC board if I had only by accident chosen to have the shift register go left to right instead of right to left. And all the other pins worked out to just exchanging a couple places. So I took it all apart and relayed it out. Had to have that perfection and save 3 little feed-through holes. You kind of do that when when you have the right feeling about something. The hours don't matter and the quality does. Okay. Along came VisiCalc about the same time. Now, okay, we've added a floppy disk drive. Commodore had no way to add a floppy disk drive. They had a serial port that was like a modem speed, and they could try to talk to a floppy disk through it, and it was a horrible, messy, expensive way to go. And the TRS-80 had no input-output ports. They couldn't even expand their RAM beyond 8 kbytes. Well, we needed, floppy disk comes along. You need more than 8 kbytes just for an operating system. So we were the only computer that could have an operating system. And we did. And we created a disk operating system for our floppy, and then we put VisiCalc on it. The world went crazy. All these computer stores, small businessmen were coming in and seeing they could line up sets of numbers and do comparisons so fast, and it was almost like the feeling I'd had about writing a game in software you could play with so many options that you could never think of trying in hardware. It's like they had that ability now. And now these little small computers could do more than the big computers at the corporations. And that's why they started moving in. So overnight, all the stores, people would come in, I want to buy an Apple II and VisiCalc. It was the only computer it ran on, the Apple II and VisiCalc. So we started getting this mode of thinking that a solution is what people want. They really want to solve a problem with numbers. They don't care about what hardware they have or software, but they need hardware and software together that makes that solution. We also saw the market going very much in the business direction, and we decided to pursue it with the Apple III, being more designed for business people, more of a closed machine with fewer slots. The only argument Steve and I ever had was over number of slots. He wanted 2 and I wanted 8. So we're going to finally get down to 2. Now the Apple III, marketing was getting a lot of prominence in the company. And they did some things, that I can understand, but I can't understand. And one of the things was, well, we've got to make sure that the world knows the Apple III is for business and the Apple II is for games. And so, in this machine that's going to be the Apple III, that you can boot it up as an Apple III or an Apple II because you can run multitudes of software that were in all the stores. If you boot it up as an Apple II, we had to put in extra chips to disable as many characters on the screen and to disable the extra RAM to make it look like less. So we put in chips to make it worse. And I tell it as a funny story. In the end, the Apple III never really went. It was a big failure. Everybody's using Apple IIs. It had caught on to masses, and there were lots of software, and it was easy to design peripherals and software for. And the IBM PC came out, and boy, they had an into companies. They just put the IBM PC on the same sheets that they sold their big computers on, and so they had the arm to take over the business market. And the company, it's funny because one of the things is we had this big, huge, successful computer that had made us this huge, great company, the Apple II. And for 3 years, 1980 to 1983, it was the largest selling computer in the world. And in those 3 years, we didn't advertise it. We had full-page ads in Newsweek and Time and everything, and they always advertised the Apple III. Everybody in the company had an Apple III on their desk. Everybody was working for this product, the Apple III, and it never went. And, a fair accounting would have shown an unbelievably high loss for that one product. But the company was just raking in so much money with a successful product that it was easy to kind of hide and cover up. That's over the years. Okay, I don't want to go any further because we've taken so much time. I'm not going to lead up into, Macintosh design stories and being around that. I think it's time for questions and answers. I think you've had enough of me for a while here. So anybody, let's see what we got. Thanks.
You might imagine there are plenty of questions that have accumulated, but I'm actually going to take the MC's prerogative to ask the first question. I loved your story about building your own computer and starting with the chips and doing the design. I spoke to a kid the other day who said he just finished building his own computer, and when I pressed him, it turned out he'd bought a motherboard, and he plugged in the disk drive, and he plugged in the keyboard, and that was building a computer. He didn't know the first thing about digital design. Is that a problem? Is digital design going to go the way of the users of slide rules, or should people still learn digital design?
It's only a problem for those of us who experienced the fun of being able to buy your own parts and build your own computer up, and it's getting a little hard to do that now. It's getting hard to do all types of electronics now. But it's only a problem in our own mind. In other words, the kids who grow up now, they've got their games and their own things they get expert at, and their online chat rooms and their PDAs and their game machines. So they've still got a world.
If you have any other questions, by the way, continue to fill out your cards and hand them in to the collectors, and we'll get to as many of them as we can. What is the Super Wozniak integrated machine, and what does it do?
In the days of Apple that I was trying to describe, the early days, there were about 5 of us that ran the company for 2 years. Steve Jobs and myself and Mike Markle, who joined us and ran marketing. We also had a president who took us from the start to when the company went public, Mike Scott. Not very many people hear his name, but he had a kind of a rather important role. And also Rod Holt was an analog engineer. Now, the first digital engineer we hired was Wendell Sander. Okay, and Wendell Sander came in and he designed this thing called the super integrated integrated machine, or SWIM, or whatever it was called. And basically it was just an integration of my disk design. Yeah, I don't know why that question comes up a lot.
Okay. Are you still friends with the other Steve? How often do you see each other socially?
Yes, I don't see him socially like all the time, maybe, once a year, as often as I want. We talk on the phone more often than that, though. And it's always pleasant. I've never had an argument with him. What?
Except for the number of slots.
Oh, except for the number of slots. Well, on the number of slots, I said, okay, go get another computer.
How important were Don Valentine and Sequoia Capital to the building of Apple?
I can't remember. I didn't pay close enough attention to that. Hank Smith, I forget his name of his company, was the one that we were really pursuing for our first venture money, which was $300,000, a little ways in to running with the Apple II.
At HP, which calculator chips did you work on? Did you write any of the firmware, or were you just doing the digital design?
I did not do any firmware at Hewlett-Packard. I was around the people that did it. I did just digital design on the arithmetic and registered chips.
How long did it take to write the BASIC for the Apple I?
The BASIC for the Apple I was the hardest project of the entire Apple I or Apple II or any of the projects I took on by itself. I had no idea. I'd never written a language before, and it probably took me 6 man-months, but it probably happened over about 4 months.
Do you have any other BASIC interpreters to look at, or were you starting from scratch?
I had no other interpreters to look at. I had never done one in my life. I'd never seen one. I just started from scratch. And I had actually sat in classes way back in college days and tried to learn how, in assembly language on it with Nova code, to write a Fortran compiler, some of the starting steps. So I'd thought about it.
What was your hardest lesson that you learned?
The hardest lesson that I learned, gosh, I don't know how to interpret that. Sorry, can't answer that one.
What did you mean when you said that by accident you chose the right 4K RAM?
The Intel RAM was very, very fortunate because it was the only one of the 3 4K RAMs that were introduced that became the same pinout when the 16K RAMs came along and the 64K RAMs. So the pinouts, you could actually plug 16K or 4K's RAMs into our Apple II boards, and we had these little plug-in adapters that you'd plug it in to tell it what kind of RAMs you had used. We had a huge RAM advantage. We could expand. We had 3 rows of RAMs. I mean, Commodore and the PET had no RAM expansion. They were stuck at 4K or 8K bytes. And we could go up to 48K bytes on the motherboard, and then we had all these slots.
What became of your ham radio career? Are you still in?
Back in those days, you got a ham radio license. Let's see, and a novice license was 1 year. W6VLI, W6BND. I remember my 2 codes. And then later in high school, I got a 5-year technician license, but these were licenses that expired back then. It was a different world, too, because built my own transmitter and receiver, some Helicrafters, real nice gear, but you solder every tube socket in and every transistor and every there are no transistors, every capacitor, and you bolt the whole thing together. It was a build-it-yourself job, so it was real good training.
What projects are you working on these days?
Oh, I have not been working in so long, and I get asked that question all the time, and I say, not really working on things, kind of working with schools. So got a company, we're developing some technologies. I'm not free to talk about it because other people are going to sell products. I'd be stomping on them if I started trying to advertise a product that's not really going to be from our own company. Plus, there are other people that own this company, and it's not the time to talk about what we're doing. It's their money.
Do you have any regrets about your decision to leave Apple?
Any regrets about my decision to leave Apple? None at all. I didn't really leave Apple necessarily. I still get a small salary. I have never, ever been off the payroll, just out of loyalty. I've never had run-ins. I never had what they made it sound like I was upset once. The Wall Street Journal wrote an article that got copied because it was a national journal, got copied in every book's ever been published, that I had some gripes about Apple and quit. No. One time I had a plane crash, and I realized this was the last chance in my life to go to college, so I went back to college instead of work and put on some US festivals, some rock and roll shows. I'm so glad I was here. I am so thankful I was here to do that. And then another time, I wanted to start a little company with a neat idea. Just a neat little idea. Build a programmable remote control that you can press button, you can operate several different pieces of equipment and push a button and execute a sequence of commands in a row. A whole bunch of different IRs would come out. And it was a neat idea, and I just wanted to go do that. And I showed Apple on blackboards what I was going to do, got written notes that it wasn't competitive, and I still stayed on Apple's payroll. So I don't know. I never really, I left. I'm obviously not there, but in my heart I am.
What do you think are the next big things in technology? What comes next?
I don't like to be one of these predictor-type people. I know some people, I'm around others that do it extremely well, and they know what's going on. I saw when I was in Apple that if I tried to predict what was going to happen in our field in the next year, I knew it because we were doing it. And if I tried to predict 2 years ahead, I was always wrong. New things came from left field that I never could have predicted, and the world turned out a lot differently. And what standards and what ways that people use their computers changed so much 2 years out, I just don't want to predict. I mean, it's just too scary to try to predict. You can predict real general things, based on just assuming that, yeah, we're going to have a chip that can have 500 movies on it someday and hold it in our hands, and what does that mean? But, but I don't like to go into these outer space predictions, so I'm sorry.
Well, Steve, you don't need to predict. You're already part of history, and you've done enough retroactive predicting by creating the personal computer revolution, or helping to. So, thank you.
They didn't predict that.
Thank you for coming. Thank you all for coming.
I'll be happy to talk to people.
Steve said he'd be happy to talk to people if you want to come around and speak to them.
Great job.
Thank you
Great
all.
job. Great job. Nice going.
Super. Good to be back from the Macintosh.
Uh-oh, what do we got?
We had a small gift for you to remember your evening here today.
Oh, excellent. All right.